This is Mekuria, and today I'd like to briefly discuss the Six-Day War and how the Johnson administration handled the 1967 Arab-Israeli conflict. To understand how the Six-Day War came about, think back to 1948 when Israel declared independence. What followed through the 50s and 60s were cross-border raids, increasing mistrust with Arab neighbors, and the 1956 Suez Crisis, which set the stage for further conflict. By May 1967, tensions were extremely high, with the final straw being Egyptian President Nasser's expulsion of UN peacekeepers from the Sinai Peninsula and the closing of the Straits of Tiran in the Red Sea to Israeli shipping, an act which Israel viewed as an act of war. What followed were Egypt, Syria, and Jordan's mobilization of forces, which Israel interpreted as a threat to its survival. So on June 5th, Israel launched a preemptive strike, which marked the beginning of the Six-Day War. By the end of the war, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Due to Cold War tensions and the Vietnam War, the Johnson administration pursued diplomacy, avoiding direct military intervention. The Johnson administration recognized that a conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors could risk bringing in the Soviet Union, ultimately threatening U.S. credibility, freedom of navigation, and access to resources like oil. With this understanding, the National Security Council prioritized de-escalation, intelligence-driven decision-making, and diplomacy while accelerating long-term U.S. and Israeli security, as well as U.S. regional engagement. President Johnson's main objectives were to prevent superpower escalation, avoid direct U.S. combat, and maintain regional stability. The State Department, led by Secretary Rusk, focused on diplomacy and engagement at the UN. The Department of Defense, led by Secretary McNamara, monitored military readiness, especially the U.S. Sixth Fleet, and the CIA provided critical intelligence, reassuring Johnson that Israel would likely achieve victory. While interagency coordination was managed through the NSC, attention and resources were limited, largely due to the ongoing Vietnam War. In terms of allies, the United States coordinated with the UK, France, and West Germany, providing weaponry to Israel and managing tensions with the Soviet Union. For purposes of deeper analysis, I decided to use the SWOT technique just because it's a very structured way, I believe, to examine the US government's internal strengths and weaknesses, as well as the external threats and opportunities in the Middle East at the time. For the sake of time, I would identify the greatest strength being strong intelligence and effective interagency coordinations. I would say that the biggest weakness were the domestic constraints due to the Vietnam War, which limited the United States' positioning in the region. I would say that the main opportunity was strengthening the U.S.-Israel alliance and reinforcing U.S. credibility. And I would say finally that the biggest threat is rising anti-American sentiment in the Middle East. In reflecting, I would say that this conflict was of vital national security interest because one could argue that if Israel lost the war, U.S. footing in the Middle East could have been seriously weakened. I would say the impacts on national security then were maintaining credibility and preventing Soviet escalation. Now it reinforces the U.S.-Israel alliance, and in the future I think it set a precedent for continued American engagement in the region. I think that Johnson's use of the NSC was sufficient, though I would have suggested more coordination with Arab nations, like engaging with their governments more diplomatically, sharing intelligence, and also, reducing regional tensions in a way that would limit the blow of the conflict on their side. Overall, the outcome was definitely a tactical success, although its long-term consequences are definitely complex, as we can see in the ongoing crises in Gaza and the West Bank. Overall, I'm quite confident that I used credible sources. They're a mix of government archives, historical analysis, and policy research, I would say that they're reliable because they're based on primary documents and expert analysis. In terms of gaps, there are some, specifically when interpreting whether or not the war was truly a victory, as well as the long-term negative consequences, and I would say that there are definitely some debates over whether or not Israel's actions were purely self-defense. Though all in all, these sources definitely helped me understand Johnson's decisions as well as the US response.